The story begins on a clear, sunny day in his previous life. A man named Takakuro Rizo was getting ready for work. But as he stepped out of his apartment, he knew for sure that he was too tired to even move. So he collapsed to the ground, his heart pounding. Takakuro Rizo began to pray that he didn't want to die like this. And then, Takakuro Rizo's life came to an abrupt end. However, that man was given a second life in a strange new world, where he was now known as Walm. He clasped his hands together again out of habit. Just then, a man named Jose said they needed to team up together once more. They were all worried that their commander would start bragging about the results of the war again. Speaking of the war's results, it seemed that Guam had taken down 9 enemies in a single go. Jose then said that Walm should also be proud of himself, as he had achieved so much in such a short time. However, Walm simply replied that things like that were nothing to be proud of. Jose then asked Walm why, in a voice so cold no one could top it. Walm answered that he only did all these things because it was his job. He asserted that he didn't kill people just to add to his count, because for him, when his superiors ordered a kill, it was his duty to carry it out like a loyal soldier. Walm now lived in a world where war was still constantly raging. Because of this, he always felt obligated to do what his superiors asked, just like his old self in his previous life. This made Jose start to think Walm was a very strict person. After finishing their mission on the battlefield, they decided to leave the bloody scene and head back to the barracks with their troops that night. Everyone was resting and enjoying themselves after a major battle had ended. Meanwhile, Walm sat quietly enjoying his meal. Suddenly, a large man walked in, calling Walm's name. As soon as he placed his hand on Walm's shoulder, he said he'd heard rumors about Walm taking down 9 enemies by himself. However, the man, reeking of alcohol, proudly declared that he still won, because he had taken down 15 enemies. Commander Dway intentionally pitied Walm, saying that he wasn't too bad himself. Walm, who knew exactly how Dway thought, joked that he knew he still couldn't beat someone like Commander Dway. Hearing this, Dway, who was none other than Commander Dway, laughed loudly, agreeing that at least Walm wasn't lying because he still lacked the skills. Suddenly, 2 other people walked in. One of them said that magic was one thing, but skills were like a cheat. Jose replied that they were the 2 new recruits who survived the battle. One of them was a coxcomb named Burrito, and the other was Nor. Commander Dway immediately started arguing with Burrito, insisting that his skill wasn't a cheat, but his true power. Burrito, who always stuck to his principles, still insisted that it was cheating no matter what. Meanwhile, Nor asked Dway if it was true that his warhammer could defeat any kind of armor. Commander Dway, full of himself, nodded and confirmed that it was absolutely true. Walm, curious to know more about the story, asked if that was something Dway had wished for. Jose quickly answered Walm's question, saying there was no way Dway wouldn't want that. In the end, one of the commander's most powerful skills was a technique that was almost certain to annihilate the enemy. Jose was desperate to get special skills like that, because he believed that just one such skill could change the tide of war and make them a lot of money. Jose then asked Walm if he'd like to have a skill of his own. Walm, ever the straightforward one, replied that as long as it was free, he'd take it. When Jose continued to ask Walm if he was interested in magic, Walm replied that it was still something worth dreaming about. Jose was completely shocked to hear about Walm's dream. Jose even reported it to the commander immediately. However, their brief moment of joy was quickly interrupted, as they began to discuss their battle plans for tomorrow, with a series of battles awaiting them. From tomorrow onward, their opponent would be mired. Today was the day they officially parted ways with the Liberation Trade Federation. The High-Cirque Empire had begun assembling its troops in the city of Saria, located in the northwest of the former Konoha Kingdom, bordering Mayrd. However, the fight against the Liberation was just the beginning. Their ultimate goal was to defeat Mayrd. Commander Dway then declared that while things had been quite interesting so far, the real battle would begin tomorrow. It would be completely different from anything they had ever experienced before. This was going to be a major battle, and they all had to be mentally prepared. The next day during the battle, Walm seemed to be struggling with his morals. However, he had no other choice as he was still just a soldier following orders. When the number of people Walm had killed reached 10, he suddenly snapped out of his daze, realizing they were still on their way to the battle and that his mind was already lost in it. When they finally arrived in the city of Sori, poverty was rampant everywhere. Walm saw a prostitute begging for work. Walm couldn't bear the sight of her struggle, so he gave her a few coins so she could buy some food. Jose, on the other hand, warned Walm not to get too friendly with anyone, as it could lead to unwanted trouble. However, Walm couldn't resist his compassion for the beggars struggling to survive, as he himself knew all too well the inner pain of being new to this world. Walm couldn't support himself on farming alone, which is why he became a soldier. The subsidies from the army were necessary to provide for his family. Without them, his parents, his siblings, and Walm himself would have become beggars. As he walked through the alleys filled with starving people, Walm began to recall a time when Sari was still a place full of hope and vitality. 5 years ago, this was still the territory of the Konoha Kingdom, not Hisrav. But Konoha had been constantly fortifying its borders, causing conflict with the Hisrak region. Walm was even surprised that they had been able to win that battle and protect the village. This used to be a prosperous land, bustling with people, with vast fields and delicious food. But now, Konoha was facing its worst of times. Jose then asked the commander what the reason for this decline was. Commander Dewey replied that Archduke Myard was once a nobleman of Konoha. He took advantage of the Hisrak War, betrayed Konoha, and defected to the neighboring kingdom of Farius. The armies from Farius and Myard's own forces proceeded to ravage every territory of Konoha, turning it into a dead land. You could say this land has become this way because it was sold to Archduke Myard. The Hisark army also blockaded and postponed their invasion until now. That's why the people's hatred for Myard and Farius was much deeper than it was for Hisard. Farius was much deeper than it was for Hisard. The war continued, even as Hisard joined the invasion of Myard. Hearing all of this made Walm think that the enemy he needed to defeat next was that very person that he had to defeat next, no matter what. After walking for a while, they finally arrived at a temporary resting place. While drinking, the three of them began discussing their plan to advance along the border of the city of Liberal, hoping to secure a victory. However, Walm drank too much and ended up throwing everything up. As the world spun around him, Walm couldn't accept the fact that he was calling himself a soldier. Deep down inside, he called himself a murderer. The next day, the great battle began. Commander Dewey was doing his best to inspire his soldiers, offering the kind of encouragement anyone could give. Meanwhile, the enemy army was ready on the opposite side of the field. Commander Gerard Berger was also speaking to his soldiers. He declared that those who had gathered here were symbols of the Empire's courage. With this courage, Commander Gerard hoped they would soon put an end to the war. He stressed that his soldiers should not be afraid to crush the enemy and must show their opponents that they were not afraid to win the war. They could not be afraid to claim victory in this fierce battle. Meanwhile, Walm was steeling himself for another slaughter, because this was a kill or be killed situation. However, Walm couldn't deny that he was anxious about what would happen next. Jose, noticing Walm's pale face, asked if something was wrong. Walm replied that it was just his hangover from last night and nothing to worry about. But Jose, understanding there was something more behind Walm's troubled eyes, said that if anything was wrong, Walm shouldn't be afraid to share. Jose was ready to listen to anything Walm wanted to say. However, it seemed Walm decided not to share his feelings. As for the war plan, the Empire's army, departing from the city of Saria, was divided into 3 large forces. All 3 routes leading to Mira's territory were targeted for occupation. In particular, a massive fortress blocking the main road was being defended by 3,000 soldiers, and taking it was predicted to be extremely difficult. Nevertheless, they had to do everything in their power to succeed at all costs. Dway's unit had now reached Saria's paramount fortress and was preparing for battle. Walm was worried that new recruits like Burrito might die in this battle, so he was determined to protect them as much as he could. When the signal horn blew, Dewey's unit quickly charged toward the castle, ready to face the challenging fight ahead. They were met with a barrage of attacks from the enemy. However, with resilience, they pushed forward despite all obstacles. Even though some of their comrades had fallen, Walm and Nora still managed to reach the castle walls. Since the guards were concentrated at the gate, they could enter the castle by climbing the wall. As they all climbed, attacks from above caused some to fall. Despite that, they kept their spirits high and did everything they could to reach their goal. When Walm reached the top of the wall, corpses were everywhere. However, when Walm turned back to look for Nora, he was horrified to find her body severely wounded, lying in a pool of blood. Rage erupted in Walm when he realized a knight was responsible for this. Against all odds, he charged in to fight the knight, swinging his sword from all directions, determined to avenge his comrade. Walm couldn't let this knight live, as he could finish Nora off for good. Normally, someone like him would be handled by Commander Dway, but since the commander was so prominent, they couldn't get near the wall due to constant interference. Now, Walm had to face this knight alone, which meant he had to take him down fast. However, as he tried to finish his opponent in one blow, Walm felt something strange as the knight's axe struck his body. The knight was shocked to find his spear hadn't hit Walm's eye. It turned out Walm had a magical barrier covering his entire body that even he didn't know about. This feeling was strange, like his body and his sword felt light, as if he had attained a power no one had ever had before. While the knight tried to act tough, Walm was ready to end the fight, taking advantage of his new power. Walm had just brutally taken down the knight, without a shred of mercy. After that, Walm continued to eliminate every single enemy, not stopping until most of them had fallen. After clearing out almost all the enemies, Walm checked on Nora, who was still bleeding. Nora reassured him that she was fine and there was nothing to worry about. Commanders Dewey and Jose were both impressed to see that Walm had discovered his power. However, there was no denying that the real hell was just beginning. The fortress was besieged not long after. The battle started in the morning and only ended just before sunset. But this was just the battle at the border outpost, meaning Walm's work was still far from over. A few days had passed since the siege of the fortress. Everything seemed to be returning to normal for Walme, and the others until they came across a corpse with its face almost half crushed. Some of their soldiers had escaped the siege and begun planning for a guerrilla war. On the road through the surrounding forest, the Isekai'd army advancing on Manga was stopped in its tracks. A great loss of supplies and soldiers occurred. What was so unbelievable was the absurd sight of a man whose face had been suddenly crushed. Jose, Walm, and the others began to discuss it. Walm said he didn't think the weapon was a spear because the crushed area was too large for that. It seemed the weapon used was a shield. Commander Dewey then suggested that the culprit likely possessed a special skill. Jose immediately asked the commander if he thought the perpetrator could be someone with a special skill. Commander Dewey replied that many people use strength skills, and this was most likely the iron wall skill. With this skill, even a wooden shield can become as hard as iron. If you hit someone with it, you'd end up with a corpse just like this man. At least two people have this type of ability. One who uses magic and one who uses a special skill. Manga would certainly use people with such skills in this guerrilla war, even though it's not really their style. Jose then said that an entire squad had been dispatched to find the enemy, but with no results. Instead, Isaac's army lost 30 men. As they were passing through the forest, Nora discovered something she hadn't expected at all. A person was hanging from a tree, cold and dead. They were later identified as the forest dwellers, the ones who had sold information about the Isekai'd army to the Manga army. Walm told Nora that there was a time when he wasn't used to these things. Someone once told him that these very people were the reason dozens of innocent people were killed, so there was no need to feel guilty about what was happening to the forest dwellers. Then an alert was sounded, announcing that the Manga army was on its way to attack, and that the soldiers needed to prepare to engage. Walm charged forward, determined to kill as many enemies as possible. When he got a clear look at the enemy, it turned out they were top-rank adventurers. Nora, not understanding what top-rank adventurers meant, immediately asked Jose. He explained that they were people who specialized in suppressing demons and clearing dungeons. It was no surprise the Manga army was so good at guerrilla warfare, since they had the support of adventurers. Walm figured that if they were all adventurers, then the only ones left must be the elite knights. On the other side, Commander Dewey, who was also fighting the enemy, was furious to discover that the Adventurers Guild was interfering in the war. However, the guild's leader declared that they were merely freelance soldiers, hired for the job. Back with Walm, he was deeply shocked when he realized one of his enemies was just a child. Regardless to him, all magic users were just a nuisance, which meant he would kill the child no matter what, with a cold and ruthless look in his eyes. Walm mercilessly killed everyone who stood in his way. He told anyone who begged for their life to just give up, because no one was coming to save them in the end. The little girl then screamed, asking how Walm could kill people so quickly. Walm looked at her with the coldest of glares, asserting that on the battlefield, you do what you have to do. Besides, Walm was certain the girl herself had already killed several people. Since this was a meaningless conversation, Walm decided to end it immediately. However, it seemed the little girl was very well trained and was able to dodge his attack. But there was one thing Walm realized. The girl was completely unused to killing. Even so, that wasn't going to stop Walm from killing her. As Walm charged toward her, just as his weapon was about to reach her, a long-haired man intervened in time. It turned out the girl was actually the leader of the adventurers, so no matter what happened, She had to be protected at all costs. However, the man who tried to help her ultimately met a tragic fate, while Walm was trying to kill her. A hidden magic began to radiate from the area. It was so powerful that Walm wasn't the only one who could feel it. As it turned out, it was all the little girls doing. As Walm prepared for a decisive fight, the girl found an escape route, allowing her to escape death. The Hyzerk army figured that to be able to do this, she must have expended a considerable skill, there was no doubt about it. Jose asked Due if they should pursue her. Due replied that it wasn't necessary, since the main force of the remaining Maillard army had been dealt with. Therefore, there was no reason to do more work than needed. From here, the army would continue its advance toward the capital of Maillard, while everyone was discussing their next move. Walm was once again lost in his thoughts. In his mind, those adventurers were truly skilled. If they had been used to witnessing death, his side might have been the ones to die. Walm thought to himself that he didn't want to kill people, just because he wanted to. It seemed there was a much deeper reason than anyone could imagine. Meanwhile, the girl was still sobbing, expressing her confusion about Walm's issues. Then an entity appeared, uttering the words, "Surrender." Clearly, it would only be a matter of time before we find out what this entity is. The next day, it was business as usual for Walm and the Hyzerk army. One of Walm's comrades asked him to hold his hand. Walm was a bit confused at first, as he didn't understand why. But his comrades then explained that since Walm always wanted to learn about magic, they could teach him while they had some free time. Walm, incredibly excited, immediately smiled upon hearing the offer from his comrades. As they held hands, the two of them began their magic lesson. Meanwhile, the others looked on in confusion, wondering what the two were doing. Jose explained that Willert, their comrade, was transferring magical energy to Walm to teach him how to use it. This made their comrades wonder if this would actually allow Walm to use magic, even for a short period of time. Jose went on to explain that after the lesson was over, everyone would find out whether or not Walm had an aptitude for magic. Perhaps he would be able to use fireballs or water spears just like Willert while they held hands tightly. Walm looked exhausted but still tried to focus. Willert advised him to focus on everything. Walm felt a chill run through his body. He said it was fine, as this was a necessary condition for using elemental magic. As long as Walm kept concentrating, he would get it quickly. When Willert let go of Walm's left hand, he told Walm to focus on his palm and imagine a river or an ocean. It was enough for Walm to visualize any form of water. Walm did as Willert said and thought of water. And just like that, he was able to create water in the palm of his hand. Looking at it, Walm felt very happy and proud of himself. However, it seemed Willert wasn't at all impressed with what Walm had done. According to Willert, even though it was a usable amount of water, that didn't mean it was good enough. So Willert thought that Walm should experience the same hardships he had and go learn about people. Meanwhile, Walm was drenched in sweat. Willert told him not to overdo it and to conserve as much magic as possible. Compared to the explosive magic Walm used for his skills, water magic required less mana. This confused Walm, as he didn't understand what Willert meant. Walm then asked if he had been using magic all this time. Willert explained that both body enhancement magic and skills required magical power. To put it simply, when Walm uses magical power for elemental magic like fireballs and water lances, it's considered magic. But when he uses techniques like a powerful strike or an iron wall, he's using magical power to enhance his body or weapon. Those are called skills. Willert was a bit surprised that Walm didn't know this. Walm explained that he was raised on a farm under a military regime, so he was illiterate. With that, Willert decided to test if Walm had an aptitude for fire elemental magic. Walm repeated what he had done before, but this time with fire in mind. Willert only looked away for a second, and when he turned back to look at Walm, he was completely shocked to see Walm creating a huge flame. Everyone immediately panicked because it started a huge fire. Walm repeated what he had done before, but this time with fire in mind. But instead of being angry about what Walm had done, Willert seemed even more delighted by what just happened, because now he could say, Walm definitely has an aptitude for fire magic. So instead of stopping, they would proceed to the next step. Meanwhile, a man delivered a message to Commander Due, and it seemed to be a message from the Allied forces. In the message, there was an order from Captain Legrand. However, after Due read the letter, all he could say was that the Allied forces were insane for coming up with such a strategy. The messenger said that this was the plan entrusted to him, and that was why Due's team had been ordered to urgently merge with the main regiment, because the battle would take place on the Beref Plains. With this, the Hyzerk army would surely face defeat. since both the Mired and Furious strongholds are located on these hills. Furthermore, observing the Haizerk army's position, it was clear that the majority of their troops would head toward the Mired army first, with a small contingent holding the rest back. All of this had been anticipated. The fall of the Haizerk army was foreseen. Meanwhile, Lord Furious Winston of the Furious army was enraged that the Haizerk army was so foolishly desperate to defeat them. The fact that the Haizerk army wanted to hold back their 6,000-strong army was even more absurd. That was why Lord Furious hoped to make a few skeletons out of the Haizerk soldiers. When Lord Furious checked on his army, it seemed everyone was ready, and knowing that the Mired forces would be attacked by Jeff's cavalry regiment made him think the Haizerk army was quite sharp. The attack would be led by the strongest forces they had, but in the end they were no match for them. Lord Furious fought for no one but his country, so he would ensure both the Mired and Haizerk armies died on the battlefield today, and everything would belong to Furious. Now that the Haizerk army had begun its march, this only marked the beginning of everything. With the Mired army totaling 25,000 soldiers and the Haizerk army around 15,000, the battle would officially begin, back with the Haizerk army. Jose asked Walm why he thought the Mired army looked so ferocious on the battlefield. Walm replied that he thought it was because they were in Farius's homeland. Commander Dway realized that the reason they were sent into battle was to be annihilated. However, Nor didn't understand this, since the enemy was still standing still even though the battle had begun. This angered Dway, especially since the enemy had taken so long to prepare this deployment plan. He would explain it to them as briefly as possible. Dway would explain it to them as briefly as possible. The Ligarian regiment, which included Dway's squad, would quickly converge with Jeff's cavalry regiment. This plan left Walm feeling confused, because they knew full well that having infantry and cavalry run together was just too reckless. No matter how you looked at it, the only question Dway's squad had was why it had to be them. The representative then said that it seemed the Ligarian regiment had a lot of experience. However, Commander Dway absolutely refused to accept their reasoning, because it meant that they, as humans, would have to run alongside horses, even if their hearts were about to burst and their lungs were about to explode. No one could stop, because if they did, they would be trampled by the soldiers running behind them. If one person stopped, they would die, and if they wanted to live, they had to kill the enemy in front of them while still running. The fact that their squad was placed on the front line was even more ridiculous. Commander Dway then blamed Walm because it was his frantic use of that power strike in the last battle that made the Allies think they were so strong. Furthermore, their squad had not just one but two power strike users, and on top of that, they even had ammunition magic. So it was inevitable that the Ligarian regiment's commander had high expectations for them. While they were taking the time to discuss these unexpected developments, the battle continued to rage on behind them. They had stopped when Commander Dway realized that the order to attack still hadn't been sent. He began to worry that something bad might have happened to the vanguard, which would mean the plan might not be going smoothly. But Dway remained optimistic, telling himself that Commander Berger wouldn't misread the situation. However, no matter what happened, the main armies from the other territories had finally arrived. The Haizerk army didn't know what to do next. They started to panic about the plan, as no attack order had been given. To make matters worse, the Mired reserves were also on their way. So if they did nothing, they would surely be annihilated. With that, the Haizerk army had no choice but to act on their own. Some soldiers started to charge the Mired army, since that was the enemy they had to fight first, leading others to join in. In the end, the Haizerk army was literally running straight to their deaths, and the commanders couldn't control the situation. Fighting alongside the cavalry was tough, and now that they had nearly made contact with the enemy, the situation became even worse. The commander, along with Walm and the others, had also found their way to fight alongside everyone else. Commander Dway then announced that it seemed they had baited them all out. Walm didn't understand what the commander was saying, so he asked him about it. Dway then said it was just a gut feeling he had. But it seemed the plan to pretend the Haizerk army was doing poorly and lure the enemy in was going quite smoothly. Turns out the plan everyone was told was actually just a ruse, and they had deceived the enemy by using their own allies. This had resulted in most of the enemy forces getting tied up with the Haizerk army, leaving the other military headquarters with fewer numbers. The army's mission now was to quickly defeat the other military headquarters. This plan involved their main army, who were acting as bait, and now they didn't have much time left to win. They had no choice but to crush the enemy's military headquarters before that happened. Meanwhile, Willard and Walm attacked from the front. As they were the only two who could use elemental magic, with Willard's water magic and Walm's fire. The enemy's first line of defense was defeated in the blink of an eye. Now that an opening had been created in the enemy ranks, this was a huge advantage for the Haizerk army. One by one, the Haizerk army cut down every enemy in every direction. Commander Dway then ordered the soldiers to remove as many of the anti-cavalry fences as possible to create a path for the cavalry unit. If one man falls, there will be no tomorrow. As the horses charged onto the battlefield, everyone looked fierce and ready to sacrifice their lives for the sake of victory. On the other hand, the enemy's main force was also on its way to retaliate. However, the Haizerk army wouldn't let this be a reason for their failure, so with great dedication, they focused on their goal. Meanwhile, Walm once again found himself picking a fight with another strong man as he observed the army. Walm noticed this man clearly had different armor and weapons compared to the soldiers he had fought so far. This meant the enemy he was currently facing was a royal guard. If that was the case, then he must be from the Farius stronghold, which meant their general was very close. With that in mind, Walm yelled at the guard that he should move if he didn't want to die in a foreign land. However, instead of backing down, the guard rushed in to attack Walm with a powerful swing of his sword. Walm didn't expect the attack to be that strong. So he didn't think much of it, but when he blocked the sword, he could tell there was a lot of power behind that strike. Meanwhile, Commander Dway and the others were still struggling to fight the enemy, who seemed to be endless. Jose also noticed a strange group at the rear trying to flee without halting the invasion. Commander Dway then declared that it was the enemy general, and since no one was free to capture him at the moment, their general would soon escape. Even Commander Dway began to wonder if these soldiers were just here to buy time for their weak general. Back with Walm, it seemed he was also having a hard time dealing with the royal guard. Even with his powerful techniques, things weren't going according to his plan. Walm decided to use his fire powers. This time he swore he would incinerate the enemy at any cost. He had to use magic, but a single fireball wouldn't be enough. The fully equipped royal guards had no fear of death, so they were a formidable obstacle in his mind. As long as these men were here, the Haizerk army couldn't achieve its objective. If they let the enemy's general get away, the mission would be over. In other words, Walm had no choice but to burn everything around him, maintaining the intensity of his flames. Now Walm was literally on fire, and Jose warned everyone to keep as far away as possible if they didn't want to be burned alive. Walm was determined to kill the royal guard at all costs, so with his blue flames, he melted the man. Meanwhile, news of what was happening reached the enemy's base. A man informed Lord Farius that it had become dangerous to remain in the area, and they had no choice but to join the main regiment. Because if their general died in battle, the entire army would collapse. Lord Farius then grew angry at what his soldier had said, as this only meant he would have to flee and abandon the fortress. Then another man burst into his tent, announcing that their anti-cavalry defenses had been breached. They had no choice but to move as fast as possible if they still wanted to survive. Then a massive explosion suddenly went off, startling Lord Farius awake amidst the chaos. Recalling a time when someone had told him that on the battlefield, if you see a blue flame, it could only mean hellfire, that death itself had been summoned. This flame was called Ignis Farius, as if someone had opened the very gates of hell. Just then, the commanding general, Lord Farius, had a feeling about what was about to happen to him. Now that Walm had cornered General Farius, despair would continue to spread along with the color blue. However, instead of panicking at the realization that he was so close to death, General Farius remained arrogant, declaring that Walm was just an ordinary soldier who thought too highly of himself. General Farius spoke to Walm with a confident voice, asserting that he was the commander of the Maillard army and the expeditionary forces of other lands. Therefore, if anyone should feel afraid, it ought to be Walm, whom he called a nobody. Walm, on the other hand, began to wonder if the commanding general before him was the real deal or just a body double. However, upon closer inspection, he finally confirmed it was indeed the general. Walm then told the general that he should surrender. He knew there was no point in killing the general without reason, because having a royal as a prisoner would be very advantageous. Walm thought he would spare only the commanding general, as the Haizerk army would surely want that. However, after hearing the general say there was no reason to surrender, Walm couldn't take it anymore and began to attack the general while still trying not to kill him. He tried to move as fast as he could, because if he slowed down even for a moment, it could mean a fatal wound. The commanding general, on the other hand, was trying to fight with all his might. Everyone had to keep holding their ground. Walm felt a heavy weight upon hearing that, but he also knew that in war there's no time to rest. He turned to look at his comrades, seeing the exhaustion and anxiety etched on their faces. Jose, noticing Walm's somberness, saying that they all fought with everything they had, and the fact that they survived is a miracle. Nora, with a sad expression on her face, tried to reassure everyone. that even though the losses were heavy, they still had to keep fighting for their cause. The captain emphasized that they needed to prepare for the next battles, and only when they completed their mission could they rest. With a determined spirit, Walm nodded in agreement. Although he felt exhausted, he wouldn't give up until victory was truly in his grasp. Everyone must drink plenty of water to keep their bodies hydrated. Meanwhile, Walm looked at their commander and thought to himself that, despite his body being covered in wounds, Commander Dway still hadn't lost his will to fight. A glimmer of hope still shone in his eyes. If they defeated Farius and Myard, this war would soon be over. But would that really happen? Meanwhile, in Myard territory, the base had received a report about General Farius's unexpected defeat in battle. The question was what they would do next. The commander of the Myard group seemed worried about what was to come. In his mind, he wondered why he had to be a pawn for the Farius Empire for the past 5 years, why he had to sell out his own homeland, even his own daughter, just to avoid getting involved in the war. However, in the end, he still had to face it. Now with General Farius's death, he even considered accepting defeat once and for all. But it seemed he would have a hard time doing that, as the people still wanted to hunt him down, especially now that his crimes had been revealed to everyone. Now, he faced the risk of being killed by his own people after they defeated the Allied forces. The Heiser army entered Edinburgh, the capital of Myard, with their infantry. Walm and his group were ordered to maintain peace and order in the city, but it seemed Walm wouldn't do so. Edinburgh, formerly part of Myard City, has now been captured by the Heiserk army. The entire place is now in chaos and will surely fall into ruin sooner or later. The Heiserk army is currently in a large room with a big table, sitting and waiting for a meeting to begin. Some of the army members started to wonder what General Dway was up to, inviting them to such a grand place. The soldiers had absolutely no idea, and no matter how they looked at it, this wasn't a prison, so they didn't think there was any kind of conspiracy. While they were chatting, the soldiers had no idea that General Dway was actually listening to everything they were saying. Dway asked them if they thought he had made a mistake. The soldiers immediately insisted they didn't think so, but then added that maybe just a little. This made the commanding general wonder if their superiors would actually reward them for their work. General Jeff, the commander of the cavalry unit, said the same thing, that it might just be true. Once the drinks were served, Jose asked Dway if he knew how to drink it, since this was actually his first time at such a fancy party. All Dway knew was that when drinking this kind of beverage, the sound was important, because royalty actually drank their tea very quietly. As the soldiers sipped their tea, they couldn't hide the smiles on their faces. It seemed everyone loved the taste of the hot tea, swirling pleasantly in their mouths. Even Walm couldn't believe he was getting the chance to enjoy a wonderful product like tea. Although he didn't know much about the etiquette of the world he was living in now, he still remembered the rules from his previous world. Taking a sip of the fresh tea reminded him of things from his past life that were worth remembering. While Walm savored every drop of tea, his comrades looked at him with contempt, thinking his reaction was ridiculous for a farmer's son. While they were having a good time, laughing and arguing, a man walked into the room, silencing everyone. As the man entered, the entire team immediately stood up, showing their utmost respect. The older man told them to sit down, as it was impossible to have a conversation while standing. He was a seasoned veteran, a hero of the war. None other than General Belga, who was known as the brains of the war. When he sat down, he immediately took a sip of tea as if it were nothing. Once he had grasped the situation, he immediately declared that he was surprised to hear reports that not only had the cavalry defeated the commanders of many forces, but Dway's own infantry had done so as well. Even Belga felt he had been outdone, especially by all of them. He thought he would give the reward directly to the boys, so he decided to summon them here personally. General Dway, looking a bit sheepish, said they didn't deserve such heroic praise, but everyone knew he loved hearing it. General Belga had grown fond of Dway after hearing about his ferocity on the battlefield. General Belga even called Dway a national treasure, saying how rare it was to find commanders like him. Hearing this brought Dway immense joy. Finally, after all his hardships, he was hearing such kind words from someone whose opinion mattered to him. Of course, the general couldn't forget about Walm. With a mysterious look in his eyes, General Belga called out Walm's name. Walm was a little startled that the general even knew who he was. General Belga then explained in detail how, just 6 months after joining the squad, Walm had been tempered in battles near the border. Through that training, he had acquired many of the skills and the strength he now uses in combat. He's a powerful weapon for his commanding officer, and not just because he learned magic. He's also a truly resilient warrior. What's more, He now possesses the anicap skill, considered one of the deadliest abilities in existence. So it was no surprise that Commander Belga was both excited and amazed by the sheer skill and power Wom possessed. Wom could say nothing but thank you. The commander then continued with the speech, saying that he had seen Agnes Pattis once before when he was young. He was glad Wom was a soldier of Hazerg, because everyone wanted to avoid being burned alive and killed by the blue flame. Everyone had heard the legends of the flame that could send anyone to the underworld. Throughout history, those who possessed this ability were often famous heroes or exceptional adventurers. Therefore, the commander wondered if Wom might be one of them. He called for Lynette to bring an item. A strange mask was then presented to Wom. Just looking at it, Wom felt a deep sense of anxiety. The commander explained that this mask was originally worn by a group of people from another world, who had launched a brutal attack against the 3 great nations. As a result, many mysteries surrounded that mask. But the one thing known about it was that its owner could also use Ignis Farius, just like Wom. The commander then asked Wom to put on the mask to see if it would fit, and to his surprise, it was a perfect fit. Besides, it really suited him. However, in Wom's mind, confusion began to mount. He started to wonder why this felt so much like déjà vu, a feeling he had experienced in his previous world. While he was feeling this, the commander went on to say that the enemy would surely fear him with this mask. So if Wom liked it, he could keep it. With the saddest face one could possibly imagine, Wom said he really liked the mask. However, it seemed the commander was hiding something. Turns out the mask was actually cursed. Wom tried to ask the commander about this, making everyone feel tense. The commander just laughed his head off, and all he could say was that the mask seemed to have taken a liking to Wom. The mask sometimes syncs with his emotions and trembles, but it hasn't caused any danger yet, so the commander said no one should worry too much about it. There have been rare cases of weapons that possess their own skills. This mask is very picky, which has been quite a problem. But it's a good thing it has finally found a suitable owner, so Wom should cherish it with all his heart. After that dreadful meeting finally ended, everyone seemed instantly exhausted. Although they were all grateful to have finally received their desired rewards, it seemed Wom had gotten something even more valuable. Even though the mask had a will of its own and trembled uncontrollably, he never thought something like this would happen to him. Although he knew this gift was unnecessary and a bit excessive, Wom would try to cherish it no matter what because it was something the commander had given him. The fact that the mask had its own will and trembled violently wasn't exactly unheard of in the world Wom now lived in. As they passed through the main road, the group came across a pile of corpses belonging to mired soldiers. It seemed these men had rushed here after losing their lord. This just went to show that even with all their wealth and power, everything could collapse in an instant. It appeared the rebels had slaughtered the Mired clan before the Hazerg army even arrived. But it seemed that besides the soldiers, civilians had also taken part in this rebellion. The number of casualties was still rising dramatically, which was why Wom was assigned the task of maintaining public order. Part of this job is to find the mired soldiers hiding in the city and those who are ignoring martial law to loot. Additionally, Wom's group will also handle the prisoners and ensure the operation runs smoothly. One by one, Wom and the other members began to round up individuals. Some tried to beg the Hazerg army to spare their lives, while others argued that they weren't soldiers. Even Wom started to question whether the person was really a soldier. To prevent chaos, he ordered his men to stop harming anyone and just do their best to maintain order. Some of the Hazerg soldiers started hearing screams and shouts from all over, as if a battle was happening somewhere. However, it was a grim realization that it was the sound of people killing each other. Meanwhile, Wom was wandering through the city, trying to check on things. He stumbled upon a place where it seemed like something had just happened. As he investigated the situation, anger welled up inside him when he heard that a group of men had broken into a house and raped a woman. They had beaten her husband to carry out their despicable plot. Although the perpetrators ran rampant, they were eventually captured after some time. Wom asked what would happen to these men. Normally, they would be beheaded, but since the Hazerg army won the war, they'll probably just be flogged. However, Wom thought that a flogging wasn't enough. Just then, Commander Dewey appeared on the scene, saying that a flogging was more than enough. The surviving soldiers screamed in agony from the first lash of the whip. By the second and third lash, they began to cry. Their skin was peeled away, their flesh was torn open. Even as they pissed their pants or passed out, they would be jolted awake by the lashes, so there was no way a criminal like that could endure it. Hearing this from the commander, the other soldiers used it as a threat to everyone, saying that if they wanted a reduced sentence, they should silently stand up and confess. On the other hand, it seemed the commander understood very well that Wom genuinely cared about these things, but he was just too afraid to say it to anyone. That night, Wom found himself relaxing under the night sky. Suddenly, a small noise from somewhere in the darkness put him on high alert. He stood up and asked who was there. He said that he would only ask one more time, and if no one answered, he wouldn't hesitate to do his worst. A man stepped out from the shadows and apologized. As soon as he realized these people weren't soldiers, he immediately said that being out at night was forbidden. The old man and the girl then said that they were well aware of the rule. So Wom asked why they were out here. The old man replied that the city was full of thieves and vagrants, so they couldn't live there anymore. He hadn't been able to protect the little girl from the terrible things outside. Wom felt a sense of compassion for the grandfather and his granddaughter. He asked more about their situation, and the old man explained they'd had to flee their home to find safety, only to now face other enemies in the city. Wom decided he couldn't just stand by and watch. He felt he had to do something to help them. Even though he knew a soldier's life was always full of danger, the perseverance and kindness of the old man and his granddaughter had touched Wom's heart. He promised himself that he would find a way to protect them amidst this chaos. With newfound resolve, Wom told the old man that he would help them find safe shelter and would protect them from the dangers lurking in the city. Wom didn't believe the old man's story, so he tried to chat with them and scare them by feigning an attack. Seeing them both panic, he let out a satisfied laugh. After getting the reaction he wanted, Wom let them go. It had been a very difficult day for him, and he thought that letting them go was a way to ease his guilt. But it only made him feel like a hypocrite. Gradually, he realized that the two of them had actually been very sympathetic towards him, even though he was the invader. He started to think that he might have killed their families and friends, and that he couldn't possibly atone for what he'd done just by giving the girl something to eat. Meanwhile, the girl was actually a member of the royal family, and she saw Wom as a hypocrite for giving her something that she knew came from wicked deeds, although her parents were dead. She, whose name was Rita, still had many duties to protect her people. So, she and the old man, who turned out to be her guardian, would head for Salta, where they would plan everything that needed to be done. 2 months later, something big was bound to happen. 2 months after the siege of the Maillard capital, Edinburgh, the Hazer army had begun fighting other nations, one by one. The Hazer army was heading straight for Farius, as Farius had supported the Maillard army in the recent battle. Their border forces had been severely weakened, and the Hazer army couldn't afford to overlook this weakness. First, they sent 2 regiments to force the towns and villages on the border to surrender. Then several regiments combined, and the Hazer army was split into 2 groups. The first group, consisting of 4 regiments, would advance into the inland areas. The second group, with 2 regiments, would surround the Farius army to prevent their main body from being attacked on both sides. Wom, who belonged to the Ligurian regiment, was part of the second group. They planned to besiege the refinery mines around the border while carrying out their mission. Commander Du Wei kept smiling the whole time, as if this were just a fun little outing for him. With 3,000 enemy soldiers occupying fortresses that left no angle for attack, these structures became multiple lines of defense for the enemy. To make matters worse, they also had the high ground. Capturing a fortress would take a lot of strength and effort, but it wasn't worth doing so. That's why the Hazer army was planning to launch continuous fire attacks on the soldiers, after forcing them to retreat into the fortresses first. Commander Du Wei declared that they should weaken the enemy's morale, then attack and annihilate them completely. However, upon hearing the commander say this, the Hazer group just laughed, and now, with the Farius soldiers shouting from behind, it seemed Commander Du Wei had no choice but to give them an encore. Thinking about what the commander had said earlier, it seemed the Hazer army was waiting for the enemy to make the first move. Seeing how relaxed everyone was, there was only one thing Wom could say about this battle. Compared to the previous ones, this one seemed rather interesting. However, 2 weeks later, it seemed the Farius army was tougher than anyone had thought. So while everyone was still waiting for the battle to start, Commander Du Wei told Wom to practice during his free time, because if he couldn't control his magic, he risked harming his comrades. Willard explained to Wom that his Ignis Farius wasn't normal magic, and in a worst-case scenario, it could incinerate an entire squad. Therefore, this abandoned tunnel would be the ideal place to train. With that in mind, Wom focused and unleashed his full power. In just one go, he was able to release that power. Meanwhile, the other members were also training. Both Burrito and Noor are training with Commander Du Wei, and it seems they're not having the best time of their lives. A few days later, Walm was finally able to control his magic to a certain extent. But there was a bigger problem. He could only use Ignis Farius for 30 seconds. If he used it for more than 40 seconds, he'd run out of mana, and when that happened, he couldn't use any powerful moves or even a simple fireball. Not only that, but his physical abilities would also drop drastically. He could even die in the process. With that in mind, Walm needed to rest, which was the most important thing right now. Jose then appeared to check on Walm's situation, but it seemed that Jose was only worried that the food wouldn't be ready in time, because the army was currently using Walm's Ignis Farius to heat their food. Although Walm never agreed to this, he was satisfied with what he could do. He never imagined that the company commander himself would show up and allow him to use his skills in such a helpful way. On the other hand, the company commander said that undermining the enemy's fighting spirit through the smell of delicious food was also part of the plan. On the other hand, the company commander said that demoralizing the enemy with the smell of delicious food was also part of the plan. Jose agreed with him. However, if possible, they wanted to avoid eating bland food, even on the battlefield. It seemed Walm wouldn't admit that Jose's cooking was actually pretty good, so he just claimed he was only eating because he'd burned through all his mana and needed the calories to recover. Jose, however, didn't seem to mind at all. Jose suddenly declared that their way of life would soon come to an end. As it seems the number of surrendering soldiers has been increasing lately, they couldn't stand being cooped up inside the walls any longer. So many were surrendering. To tease Walm, Jose said that the delicious aroma from his cooking probably contributed to that as well. Jose laughed as he imagined being the other soldiers trapped within the walls with their fortress completely besieged. Whether day or night, the sounds of war echoed all around them. They had to ration the meager supplies they had, day by day, while the enemy outside was enjoying delicious meals. It had to be the worst feeling imaginable. A day or two of that might make someone sick and irritable, but if it went on for a whole week, it would surely break their spirits. That said, 3 days later, it was time to crush the enemy, starting with Walm's blue flame as the signal to begin a new battle. Before the attack, the entire Heiser army was holding a meeting. The terrain of the mines seemed quite difficult to handle, plus it was a fortress. Since it was narrow, deploying troops would be very difficult, which meant they couldn't overwhelm the enemy with numbers alone. And that's where Walm came in. He was to carry out a night attack with a small team. His mission was to use his Ignis Farius and cause absolute chaos inside the walls. Hearing this made Walm anxious, but he really had no other choice, since it was an order from his superiors. Walm was also assigned to bring a wind element user to make the plan a success. Elsewhere, while Walm and some soldiers created chaos inside the walls, the others would take advantage of the confusion to have the 2nd Battalion take down the fortress in one go. Although Walm didn't like the idea of this plan one bit, since it seemed the leaders saw him as some kind of firebug, he had no choice but to agree to the proposed plan. That said, the plan was simple. As long as Walm created a panic inside, everything would go smoothly. While the night was still young, Walm and a few soldiers went to survey the area. It seemed they would be targeting the defense tower where the majority of the enemy's soldiers were. Walm's mission was simply to infiltrate the area and create an opening so their comrades could charge in. That said, Walm put on the cursed mask and finally got to work. As they went inside the castle, everyone seemed a little nervous about what was going to happen next. Even Walm was relatively uncertain about what would happen. Willert told Walm that since he had a high aptitude for fire and wind, he should practice with other mages in addition to Ignis Farius. Walm asked how he should practice the wind element, along with his current magic. First, you must practice jumping really high. During the night raid, Walm followed the instructions and practiced his wind magic. When he reached the defense tower, he quickly decapitated the guards one by one with Ignis Farius, eliminating as many of them as possible. When the other soldiers noticed the attack, the entire tower immediately went on high alert. The bewildered enemy soldiers wondered what that blue flame was as it incinerated the entire defense tower. They couldn't believe their eyes when they saw the watchtower, though made of stone, begin to burn. When they finally realized they were under attack by the Heiser army, they immediately gathered as many soldiers as possible to defend their walls. Walm's companions assured him that they had him covered. As the enemy was advancing from below, they had to act quickly, or else they would have to call for reinforcements from another tower. Capturing the tower had been difficult. Now they just needed to hold their position until their main forces arrived. They needed to burn down the passageway so that no one could get through. Walm, obeying the order, ran into one of the enemy areas. His body froze when he saw a dying man screaming in agony. At that moment, Walm slowly realized that the morals and conscience from his past life had been shattered. He had lost control at Edinburgh and hadn't realized the extent of the suffering Ignis Farius caused before killing someone. Now he was just a soldier and also a murderer. He began to wonder if he would be suffering like this now, if this weren't his second life, if he had been born into this violent world instead. He told himself not to think about it because a soldier has no right to object. Farius continued to spread its power to every corner of the tower, causing many enemy soldiers to fall one after another. On the other hand, Wom was also nearly out of magic, but no one came to help. It seemed the enemy soldiers were more courageous than expected, as there were still some who didn't fear Wom at all. He was shocked when a few of them started asking if he was the one who started the fire. One of them thought of Wom, as the Heiser army had been talking about him day in and day out, night after night. Moreover, this person wanted to thank Wom for letting them smell the so-called dog food they had to cook every day. However, instead of panicking from being cornered, Wom found joy in the situation. He said that he was very sorry too, but this service would finally end today. This time, it was Wom against the enemy soldiers. To stay clear of Wom's Ignis Farius, no allies were near him. After using Ignis Farius to its limit, Wom had almost no magic left and finally had to use his special move. Wom focused all his strength and tried to fight the soldiers one by one. He even tried to use a portion of Ignis Farius's remaining power. As he was caught up in the battle, the other soldiers thought Wom had died from their attacks when there was no sign of him. However, they didn't know that he was just hiding behind the smoke to analyze the situation. Wom noticed that the soldier with the scar on his nose could defend against his blows, proving he was skilled at reinforcing his body with magic. In contrast, the bald soldier was a fire user, specializing in fire resistance. The last one was a water user, protecting the others from the flames and moving them towards Wom. So this is how they're split up, Wom thought. If that's the case, I'll attack the fire user first to make the others panic. Wom realized that all these soldiers were extremely talented, making it impossible for him to land a single attack. He felt like he was dancing in a storm of blades. One soldier after another. The enemies kept rushing him, giving him no time to counterattack. The only thing keeping him on his feet was Ignis Farius. Wom knew that if he kept fighting like this, his magic would run out and he would be tortured to death. He would do everything he could. Wom tried to maximize the power of Ignis Farius to incinerate his enemies. However, the enemy's fire resistance was just as strong. At one point, Wom didn't know what to do when all his enemies charged him at once. He began to worry a little, but ultimately decided to give it his all. He focused on attacking the soldiers one by one and gradually gained the upper hand. It seemed these soldiers cared deeply for their comrades, so much that they would do anything to save another, even if it meant sacrificing themselves. That made them terrible soldiers in Wom's opinion. Their attachment to others would be their downfall. With that, Wom eliminated 2 of the 3 enemies. Now Wom only had 1 enemy left to deal with. However, before he could get close to the last man, his supposedly dead comrades tried to stop Wom from advancing any further. Disgusted by the man, Wom punched him until he took his last breath. Then he moved on to kill the final one, who put up a bit of a fight. Wom strangled the man with his bare hands until he was dead. Finally, with them dead, Wom could breathe a small sigh of relief. However, he was shocked to see one of the burnt men still holding a sword and trying to attack him again. As it turned out, this fire-resistant one had survived the deadly attacks Wom had dealt earlier. Before the burnt man could make a move, a Heiser soldier appeared and killed him in a single blow. Wom, who was exhausted, thanked his comrade for the help. He then told them that maybe they should get there a bit sooner next time, so he wouldn't have to wear himself out like this. He had almost been turned into minced meat just a moment ago. Wom's comrades reasoned that he was still all too human, daring to charge into a wild inferno like that. Instead of arguing, they told him to get up so he could be treated. Wom sat leaning against a wall while his comrade called for help. However, he felt uncomfortable with a burnt corpse next to him, but he had no other choice but to wait for help. While waiting, Wom heard the sound of people breaking down the castle gate. He began to wonder if this was something they actually enjoyed doing, because it was truly awful. At the same time, in the northern archipelago, in the Kingdom of Crest, the trade alliance of Liberatoa and the Farias Kingdom was holding a meeting to deal with the Heiser Empire. The one presiding over the meeting was none other than Chester Crest, the king of the Crest Kingdom. The kingdom was being invaded by the Heiser Empire, and King Barristan Farius of the Farias Kingdom used to be more timid than his younger brother. But his eyes now, compared to before, no longer showed any worry or stress. Besides these kings, there was also someone that some of you might be familiar with. And that is Rita, who turned out to be a member of the Maillard family. 3 weeks after the destruction of the fortress at the Refond mine base, Walm was talking with a man who seemed to have good news to report. As the man left, he said he was glad the quiet life was finally over. It turned out that while many fortresses were under attack, the soldiers trapped in the mines were slowly destroying themselves. If one were to look at the food reserves and the size of the army, you would think they could withstand this, but facing a prolonged castle siege and mental harassment, it didn't take them long to surrender. From the Refn mine castle to every fortress, they either surrendered immediately or would be killed. The warning from the Heiser messenger was the last straw for them. That being said, now that the situation had calmed down a bit, Walm decided to get back to work and take a stroll around the newly invaded area. As he entered the central square, Jose immediately welcomed him, saying that after a few days of rest he was finally back with his old unit and, thankfully, he looked much healthier than before. Walm then said the recovery magic used on him was amazing. It healed wounds that should have taken months to recover in just 2 weeks. Seeing it for the first time was truly magical. Walm even remembered how the recovery magic healed the surface and bones first, and then the rest healed on its own. While they were talking, Nor appeared, welcoming Walm back. It seemed like everyone was very happy that Walm was doing well. Walm greeted her and asked why she looked more tired than before. Nor explained that things had been tough since then, especially since the Dewey squad was also sent to take down the castle. Furthermore, it seemed something bad had happened to Burrito, but not in the way one might think. Apparently, he had his cool haircut suddenly chopped off in a battle, which is why he was crying like a baby, unable to accept it. Although Burrito seemed a bit over the top, he was at least lucky that the rest of his body was fine. Even though his hair was a real mess, Nor kept telling him it looked good on him so he wouldn't freak out again. Walm also tried to reassure Burrito, saying that at least his hairstyle served its purpose. Now that Walm had confirmed everyone was okay, he started looking for Commander Dway. Nor informed him that the squad commander had called for him, and it seemed the mines hadn't been completely cleared out yet, so they were prioritizing that. Following the lead forces, they would also be advancing into the mired interior, so it was only a matter of time before they knew what would happen next. Back at the meeting, the chairman gladly introduced Princess Rita of Mired. However, it seemed that Hugo Evans, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs for Libertoa, thought Rita shouldn't be at the meeting, since the Mired Kingdom had been destroyed, making it strange to still have a representative. Rita then asserted that while it was undeniable that Mired had lost most of its territory, they still had the land of Serta. This land has abundant fishing resources and waterways, and is an economic hub. However, it has now become the base of the lake dragon. Although this dragon might be a subspecies, it is still a top-tier powerful monster. With something like that there, not even Hazer would dare touch it. Rita continued saying that everything Hugo said was true, but right now, the lake dragon had been subdued. This news came as a great shock to Hugo, as he never thought he would hear such a thing. He asked again if this information was accurate, because less than 6 months ago, capturing that dragon was impossible. One of the kings then spoke up, saying that he was the one who did it, a fire element user who could even tame a dragon, and he was one of the 3 heroes of Christ. Even the king had to admit that it was amazing. Although they had seen it many times, the name of this hero still caught everyone's attention. Akima Yuto. He was one of the visitors from another world, granted immense power and companions, including an assassin from Earth. Back with the Heiser army, the soldiers in the squad were celebrating having joined their ranks. Because of it, they could pillage and take any girl they wanted. All of the kingdom's trustworthy guards had been killed, and now, only the weak were left in this area. But now, it was time for them to move on to the next village, as they had stolen enough goods. However, before they could leave, a surprise attack stunned them. As they checked their surroundings, they were confused, as these people were completely different from the soldiers they knew. As the men were surrounded by an army in full armor, they realized that these weren't the kingdom's soldiers, but the people of Christ. Even as they tried to fight them one by one, they quickly realized it was futile, as the power difference was too great. Even if they fought, they would be killed. Now they began to panic, not knowing what to do next, as they were forced to abandon the village. But they had no choice but to leave everything behind and run for their lives. Although they had gathered many goods, they still had to run, because it was better than dying. The men took advantage of the twilight and quickly escaped the pursuit. As they fled, they even began to wonder why the soldiers of Christ would launch an attack in this area, telling them they should surrender because resistance was futile. The men tried to yell at the boy, telling him to get out of the way if he didn't want to die. However, one member of the group realized the boy was actually a magical illusion. After this attack, 3 Saria battalions of the Heiser army were wiped out, with about 700 soldiers not returning. On the other hand, Jose was shocked to hear they would be withdrawing their support. He honestly thought it was a joke. Meanwhile, in Walm's mind, he wondered what had happened to the plan to infiltrate the territory of the other commanders' armies. Commander Dway also couldn't believe his ears, so he asked the War Council. They told him some shocking news. The Kingdom of Christ, the Libertoa Trade Federation, and the remnants of Myard had joined forces to defeat the Heiser Kingdom. This shocked everyone, as it meant that every nation in the Northern Archipelago had now become their enemy. Wam thought that if he wasn't mistaken, every nation in the Northern Archipelago was keeping an eye on each other. For them to suddenly join forces was a surprise. Burrito then asked about the number of enemies. Commander Dway, however, said that no one should worry about the numbers, and just focus on what they were assigned to do. In total, the enemy army exceeded 60,000. On the other hand, the Heiser army deployed to Farius had only 16,000 soldiers. Even if they combined the 2 battalions stationed in Edinburgh, the total would only be around 24,000, which was clearly not enough. Meanwhile, at a meeting of the various nations, they were discussing the kingdom's proposal for a 4-nation alliance, an alliance that emphasized both the military and economic aspects of the 4 nations, with Lake Surde as the economic zone. Hugo thought this was a bold move, but to him, it sounded interesting. In any case, the glory and downfall of each nation were at stake in this very important meeting. Back with the Heiser army, everyone had informed the soldiers that the Heiser forces were on the defensive and would be retreating in stages. They would make a stand at the Sarajevo fortresses. With the number of troops and supplies they had looted, they might not win, but they wouldn't necessarily lose either. It looks like the Heiser army will retreat from this mine to Sarajevo fortress to protect their allies there, and they'll engage in a defensive battle against the 4-nation coalition. In short, the army seems to have already given up, since there's no other choice when they're so outnumbered. Commander Dway then declared to everyone that at the very least, they would not be handing it over for nothing, as they would dig deep into the mine and all prisoners of war would also be killed. In other words, right now they just need to help their allied forces as much as they possibly can. When the battle erupted, it seemed like everyone was focused on killing the enemy one by one. However, with Walm's Ignis Farius, everyone seemed to be on the right track. On the other hand, Walm had gotten used to his new role in the battle, and it was only a matter of time before he'd see just how many more people he could kill in the future.